Will you pray with me? Come, Spirit, come, fall fresh upon us as we hear these ancient writings and hear their call in our contemporary times. And may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So today you just heard Betsy read this amazing story about the disciple who forever is going to have the word doubt attached to his name, Thomas. Now in John's gospel, Jesus had shown up on Easter morning and presented himself to Mary Magdalene. We heard that story last Sunday. And then he appears to the disciples, but Thomas is not there. Thomas missed Jesus' first appearance to this core group of the disciples after his resurrection. And when the others told him that they had seen Jesus, his response was pretty much, yeah, right. Thomas doesn't believe that it happened. Now, it's fair to assume that this story is not historically accurate. It's not a report of what actually happened. John isn't writing a historical document. He's writing a story to his community. And his community were probably also struggling with doubt about the resurrection. And that, to this day even, is a pretty common doubt. In a recent Pew survey, they asked what percent of Christians believe in the resurrection. Now, you would think for Christians that'd be a pretty high number, believe in the resurrection. It turns out that it's about 70% of Christians believe in the resurrection. So that means 1 out of every 3 Christians don't believe in the resurrection. And that doubt resonates with me. I get it. As a follower of Christ, I had to do a lot of research and reflection to come to my own understanding of what the resurrection is. I wrestled with this question: did the earliest Christians make up the resurrection? And I want to share my answer with you all today of where I came to. Now, several years ago here at MUCC, I answered that question of did the earliest Christians make up the resurrection with a very simple exercise using a ball of yarn. I mentioned this exercise to someone recently who swears that I have never done that particular exercise here. And so today I want to revisit it, because I think this exercise shines a whole lot of light on that question of did the earliest Christians make up the resurrection? So before we begin, I want to give you a preview of what's going to happen and why it's going to happen. So first off, I want to remind everyone that our New Testament is not in chronological order. It is not. When you read the New Testament, you start with the Gospel of Matthew. And then come the other 3 Gospels, and then Paul, and then the other letters, and so on. It is not in chronological order. And it turns out that chronological order really informs the answer to did the earliest Christians make up the resurrection? So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk the New Testament with you all, and we're going to put it in chronological order. Now, for those of you who have done Bible study, you know it's usually a way more interactive. So please, at any point in time, as you're following along, ask questions or clarifications, okay? We're going to start back here with Reverend Michael on the year 0 on the timeline, okay? Birth of Christ. Year 0. Now, during the next 30 years, Jesus is going to grow up, and at some point in time, he is going to start his ministry. It may be 1 year, it may be 3 years, we don't know. But right around here, I'm going to give that to Doug and Sue. You don't have to hold it tight, but you do have to not let go, okay? Okay. sometime around that point, Jesus is tried and executed, right around the year 30, okay? Now, somewhere around the year, Bill, I'm going to give this to you. Within about 1 to 5 years, we're not really clear, Paul is going to have an experience, a spiritual experience of the risen Christ. I don't use the word conversion. Paul was a Jew. He never stopped being a Jew. He didn't convert at any point in time. But he had this radically amazing experience and conversion, an experience, spiritual conversion of the risen Christ. That happens a few years after Jesus dies. And Paul takes some time of reflection, and then he hits the road. And he starts traveling around the Mediterranean. I'm going to give that actually to you, Steve. Thank you. And he goes out and he sets up communities of followers of Christ all over. Now, the reason we know this is because Paul communicated with those communities through letters. And the very, very first one we have, this is going to you, George. The earliest Christian writing is around the year somewhere between 40 to 43, 42, 44. Paul's letter to the Thessalonian community. And so Paul has been out forming these communities and then moves on to other communities. But the communities stay in touch with him, and so he writes letters back. So the earliest Christian writing we have is this letter that goes to the Thessalonian community. And the question they're asking is about resurrection. They are not asking, did the resurrection happen? It's very clear from this letter, Paul has preached and taught the resurrection. The question this community is asking is, what does the resurrection mean to me? What does the resurrection mean to the people I love? Okay? So within 10 to 12 years of Jesus dying, we have the first kind of archival document from these early Christian communities. Okay, this one's going to you, Lindsay. The next letter goes to a community called the Galatians. Now, Paul has moved on from this community, and he hears that someone has come into this community and is teaching that community something different than what he taught them. So he fires off this just fiery letter. If you could imagine this letter, it's all caps. That's what this letter is. And Paul is so angry because this new person has come in and started teaching something different. This new something that this person is teaching has nothing to do with the resurrection. It has to do with how their faith is being lived out. To put it very bluntly, it's about whether or not adult males should be circumcised to be a Christian. And Paul has very strong feelings about that not happening. So Paul sends this letter to the Galatian communities to say, you need to listen to me, not that person. And the reason you need to listen to me is because I have experienced the risen Christ. So within about 12 years of Christ dying and letters to the Galatians, we have the first witness to the resurrection. Okay, Carla, I'm going to give that to you. Well, actually, I'm going to give that to you, Ruth, but you're knitting. Can I loop it around your arm? There you go. Okay, so next letter is Paul's letter to the Corinthian community. So this is a letter to a community that's really struggling. They've got so many issues, and it's a big, long letter filled with lots of stuff. Lots of questions about the resurrection. None of them are, did the resurrection happen? It's like that letter to the Thessalonians. How does the resurrection, what does it mean in my life? How do I live it out, right? So what's really important about Paul's letter to the Corinthian community is that for the first time within, say, 15 years of Jesus dying, we're going to get the list of who Jesus appeared to after the crucifixion. And it goes like this: Peter, the apostles, James, who is Jesus' brother, who will go on to lead the Jerusalem church, an unknown list of 500, the disciples, and then Paul himself. So for the first time in Corinthians, we're going to get the list of people that Jesus appeared to, okay? Okay, I'm going to go back to you, Lauren. Now, after Corinthians, there's going to be 4 more letters that Paul's going to send. Throughout all of them, it's going to be very clear that Paul is teaching and preaching this message of the risen Christ. It's through all of the letters, okay? Okay, now during this time, there are no gospels, okay? No gospels. They're relying on oral tradition, maybe some things written down, but there's no gospels until we come to Artie. Okay, there we go. Now, this is about the year 70. In the year 70, we're going to get our first gospel, and it's the Gospel of Mark. It's very short. In Mark's gospel, after Jesus, on the 3rd day, the women will go to the tomb. The tomb will be empty. They will not see Jesus. They will see this angel that will appear to them and say, "Go tell the men to go to Galilee. The story isn't over," basically, okay? So year 70, we've got this resurrection story, and it's clear the story isn't over, okay? So that's Mark. Now we're going to come to Becky, and we're going to encounter the next 2 gospels that are written within about 10 years of each other, Matthew and Luke. And they're going to borrow heavily from Mark. Some might say really heavily, right? But then they're going to add to it things that are unique to their community. So Matthew's resurrection story reads like a blockbuster. There's a big earthquake. It shoves the rock away. The angel's there. But in Matthew, we have the first appearance of Jesus. Okay? So I think, is it Steve or who's got where Jesus, Doug has where Jesus is crucified. So hold that up, Doug. Okay, that's where Jesus is crucified. Where Becky is, you want to hold that up, Becky? This is the first story where we actually have Jesus appearing, Gospel of Matthew, okay? Okay, I'm going to hand this to one of you two, either one, and one of you 3. We have the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Luke, we're going to encounter resurrection stories like the story of the road to Emmaus that we're going to hear next Sunday. You're going to see stories where Jesus is eating with the disciples, so a lot of interaction. And then, so this is, Becky's about year, say, 80, 85. Luke is somewhere around the 90s. And then we're going to come to our last gospel, which I'm going to give to Michael here. And that's going to be the Gospel of John. And that's where we heard our story from today. Now, in the Gospel of John, there are a lot of resurrection stories. And as Betsy finished the reading today, it says in John, this is one of many, many stories of where Jesus appeared. After John, then we're going to have a lot of different letters, finally ending up with the book of Revelations, which will end it. It's the latest one. If you have any interest in that one, that's our next Bible study we're doing in 2 weeks, okay? So I want you to kind of, if you're holding the yarn, go ahead and hold it up, okay? Okay, so those are the main points if we were going to put the New Testament in chronological order, okay? Okay. Now, I'm going to hand that to Michael. Would you mind rolling that? And you all can let it drop, okay? Thank you for everybody who helped me hold that. You got to be real careful you don't snag a dog, though. There you go. Okay, so now we know what should have happened after Jesus was killed was that the story of Jesus should have ended. All of his teaching and ways of being in the world should have disappeared with him. The way Jesus healed lavishly all who needed it, the way he fed all who hungered, the way he called all to forgive and to welcome and to love, those messages should have died with Jesus. The story of Jesus should have died with him. The Jesus movement should have died with him. That's what should have happened. But we know that is not what happened to Jesus' story. And you can just see that if you put those New Testament writings in chronological order. Something happened that kept Jesus' story alive. Something happened that gave Jesus' followers the courage to go out and to keep telling that story of love in new ways. Something happened that inspired these earliest communities to start up and to grow and to spread. That something was the conviction that Jesus' story lives on. Inspiring and calling and comforting and emboldening. Early Christian communities were convinced that Rome had not defeated Jesus when they crucified him. Now, none of these earliest Christians knew how to understand the spiritual conviction that Jesus' story wasn't over. None of them had adequate words to describe it. So those earliest Christians, earliest followers of Jesus, used a whole lot of metaphors and images to describe this conviction that Jesus didn't die on that day, that story didn't die. They used language like he was risen, he was seen, he was raised, and he appeared, to describe this conviction that Jesus' story and message lived on, inspiring and calling and comforting and emboldening. The common thread that is woven through all of the earliest Christian letters and stories is this conviction that Jesus' story continues on, that Jesus was resurrected. It was a central tenet of those early Christian communities. And it was that conviction that held them together. The resurrection was what connected them and inspired them to continue to live out and tell Jesus' story of unconditional love, radical welcome, expansive fellowship, gracious and lavish healings, and that beautiful call back to community and relationship with each other and with God. So did the earliest Christians make up the resurrection? I think the answer is no. Instead, I think the resurrection was what made the earliest Christians. The resurrection was that common thread that connected those communities. The resurrection meant to those earliest Christians that Jesus' story did not end with him. Jesus' story lived on to embolden, to inspire, and to call those earliest Christians. And that story continues today. You could follow that yarn through history all the way up to this moment in time and everybody here. That story continues on, calling each of us to be inspired and to be emboldened and to offer unconditional love, radical welcome, expansive fellowship, gracious and lavish healings, and an invitation to relationship with each other and to God. And so, may we be like those earliest Christians. May we respond to the resurrection, that invitation to love, to service, to peace, to healing, and to homecoming with God. May it be so. May it be so. May it be so. Amen.